betrayal from my own family and the woman I loved. When Sarah, my girlfriend, and my father made a choice that shattered my world, I decided to step back, but only to plan my next move. This isn't just about heartbreak, it's about reclaiming my life and my mother's legacy. Find out how I uncovered the ultimate betrayal and why I'm not done yet. Get ready for a story of revenge, redemption, and a comeback they'll never see coming. My name is Ethan, and if I'm honest, my life story isn't the kind you read in fairy tales. I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio, in a family that looked picture perfect from the outside but was anything but. My father, Richard, was a powerhouse in the business world, a name everyone respected, or maybe feared. He was the kind of man who could command a room with a single look, but behind closed doors, he was distant, cold, and, to me, almost robotic. My mom, on the other hand, was my light. She was warm, loving, and tried her best to shield me from my father's harshness. But when I was 12, she died in a car accident. To this day, I'm convinced her death wasn't an accident but a move by one of Dad's competitors. That's how cutthroat his world was. While I was shattered, Dad didn't even flinch. No tears, no mourning, he buried himself in his work as if nothing had happened. I think that's when the rift between us became permanent. I resented him for years, and in many ways, I still do. I spent my teenage years trying to stay out of his way. Sports became my escape, football and track. They gave me structure and a reason to stay out of the house. By the time I turned 18, I was ready to leave Cincinnati behind. I joined the Marines, partly out of a sense of duty and partly because I didn't want to owe my father anything. The structure and camaraderie of military life suited me, and for a while, I thought I had finally escaped the shadow of my upbringing. But then came Sarah. I met her at a 4th of July barbecue in a small park outside of San Diego while I was stationed at Camp Pendleton. She was there with her college friends, lighting sparklers and laughing like she didn't have a care in the world. I'll never forget the moment I saw her auburn hair catching the golden sunset, her smile so genuine it made everything else fade into the background. Sarah wasn't just beautiful, she was grounded, intelligent, and kind. The kind of person who asks deep questions and really listens to your answers. She made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt since my mom passed. Sarah wasn't like anyone I'd ever met. She was studying psychology at UCSD and had this ability to read people in ways that made you feel both vulnerable and safe at the same time. She asked me about my time in the Marines, about my family, and even about my plans for the future. Nobody had ever cared enough to ask me those kinds of questions before, let alone listen to the answers. We started seeing each other regularly. At first, it was just casual, coffee dates, walks along the beach, movie nights. But before I knew it, Sarah had become my anchor. She was my escape from the weight of my past. She teased me about how I always seemed so serious, saying, "Ethan, life's not a mission. Sometimes you've just gotta enjoy the view." When I finally opened up to her about my mom, my dad, and the resentment I carried, she didn't try to fix me. She just listened. "That's heavy," she said, "but you're not your dad, Ethan. You get to decide who you are." It was the kind of reassurance I didn't know I needed until I heard it. We'd spend hours together, talking about everything and nothing. Some nights, we'd sit on the beach, watching the waves crash under the moonlight. Sarah would lean her head on my shoulder and say, "Promise me something, Ethan. Promise me you won't let life harden you." I didn't respond right away. How could I promise something I wasn't sure I could keep? Instead, I just hold her hand tighter, hoping it was enough. Sarah brought me into her world, a world full of warmth and connection. Her family was nothing like mine. Her parents weren't perfect, but they were present. They invited me to Sunday dinners where her dad would tell cheesy dad jokes, and her mom would fuss over whether I'd had enough to eat. It was overwhelming at first, but it felt good. It felt normal. I started to picture a future with Sarah, a house, kids, a life far removed from the cold, sterile upbringing I'd known. But as much as I wanted that, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't good enough for her. She deserves someone who didn't carry around a mountain of emotional baggage. I never told her that, of course. Sarah had a way of making me believe I was enough, even when I didn't believe it myself. The thing is, life doesn't pause just because you found someone who makes it better. While Sarah was thriving in her studies, I was adjusting to civilian life. After leaving the Marines, I found work as a logistics coordinator for a shipping company. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. Sarah would always remind me, it's just a stepping stone. You've got time to figure it out. Looking back, those days with Sarah felt like a dream. But dreams, as I'd learned, don't last forever. As much as I wanted to leave my past behind, the cracks in my foundation were still there, waiting for the right pressure to make them split wide open. I didn't realize it then, but life was gearing up to test me in ways I never saw coming. It was early November when I decided it was time for Sarah to meet my dad. We'd been dating for about a year, and things were getting serious. I wanted her to understand where I came from, both the good and the bad. To be honest, I also hoped that introducing her to my dad might soften the tension between us. Maybe, just maybe, she could bridge the gap that had been there for as long as I could remember. We planned the visit for a Sunday afternoon, a time my dad usually kept open to relax between his endless business obligations. It was a crisp fall day in Cincinnati, the kind where the air smells faintly of burning leaves, and the trees are bursting with golds and reds. Sarah wore a simple blue sweater that matched her eyes, and as we drove to his house, she kept humming along to the radio, oblivious to the knots forming in my stomach. "Relax, Ethan," she said, giving my arm a squeeze. "It'll be fine. Parents usually love me, you know." I forced a smile, but the truth was, my dad wasn't like most parents. His house, a sprawling brick colonial perched on a hill in Indian Hill, was more a monument to his success than a home. Walking in, you were greeted by gleaming marble floors and a grand staircase that seemed to scream, "Look how much I've accomplished." To me, it felt cold. Sterile. We pulled into the long driveway, and as I parked, Sarah glanced at the house, her eyebrows lifting slightly. "Wow," she said, half joking. "I feel underdressed. Should I have worn pearls?" I laughed despite myself. "No, you're perfect. Just, be yourself, okay?" "Always," she said with a smile. Inside, my dad greeted us at the door. To my surprise, he was unusually warm, shaking Sarah's hand and even offering me a brief, almost hesitant smile. "Sarah, welcome. Ethan's told me a lot about you," he said. His voice was smooth, polished, his professional tone. "Thank you, Mr. Carter," Sarah replied, her smile lighting up the room. "Your home is beautiful." He seemed pleased by that, nodding slightly as he led us into the sitting room, a formal space with stiff leather chairs and an untouched fireplace. What struck me was how different he was around Sarah. Normally, he was curt and detached, but with her, he was engaging, even charming. He asked her about her studies, her family, and her aspirations, leaning forward like he actually cared about her answers. Sarah, ever gracious, answered with a mix of humility and humor that seemed to disarm him. At one point, while Sarah was talking about her dream of becoming a therapist, he said, "That's admirable. Helping people isn't easy work." I almost dropped my coffee cup. Praise? For my dad? I watched the two of them, trying to decipher what was happening. Part of me felt relieved, happy, even, that he seemed to like Sarah. But another part of me couldn't shake the unease. Why was he suddenly so attentive? Was it genuine, or was this just another performance, like the ones he gave at charity galas and board meetings? When Sarah excused herself to use the restroom, I finally asked, "So, what do you think?" He looked at me, his expression unreadable. "She's remarkable. Far too good for you, but remarkable." I laughed awkwardly, unsure whether he was joking or being his usual backhanded self. "She makes me happy," I said, almost defensively. "Good," he said simply, before turning his attention to the clock. "Dinner should be ready soon." During the meal, Sarah effortlessly navigated the conversation, asking my dad questions about his business ventures and even making him laugh with a story about her younger brother's failed attempt to deep fry a turkey one Thanksgiving. I could see how much he enjoyed her company, which, frankly, was a little unnerving. This was a man who barely acknowledged my existence half the time, and here he was, practically fawning over my girlfriend. When we left that evening, I asked Sarah what she thought. "Your dad's interesting," she said carefully, her lips curving into a small smile. "He's intense, but I can see where you get your strength." "I think he likes me." "Likes you?" I scoffed. "He practically rolled out the red carpet for you." "Maybe he's just trying to connect with you through me," she suggested. I nodded, though I wasn't convinced. My dad didn't do things without a reason, and I couldn't help but wonder what his endgame was. But for now, I pushed those thoughts aside. Sarah had passed the dad test, and for a moment, it felt like maybe, just maybe, things were looking up. But like everything in my life, the calm was temporary. It would take months before I understood the full weight of that meeting, and by then, it would be too late to stop the chain of events it had set into motion. It wasn't long after Sarah's first meeting with my dad that things started to shift in ways I hadn't anticipated. At first, I thought his interest in her was a good thing, a sign that he might finally be trying to mend the strained relationship between us. For most of my life, my dad had been emotionally distant, a man who saw personal connections as secondary to achievements and status. But with Sarah, it felt like he was suddenly putting in effort, almost overcompensating. The changes were subtle at first. He'd call me out of the blue, asking how Sarah was doing. That alone was strange, considering he rarely called me for anything that wasn't business-related. "How's Sarah enjoying her classes?" or "Does Sarah need any help with her career plans?" were typical questions. "Why do you ask, Dad?" I remember asking him during one of these calls. "Just curious," he replied, his tone casual but calculated. "She seems like a bright young woman. I like her." "Well, I like her too," I said with a laugh, though his comment left me feeling oddly unsettled. By December, the invitations started coming more frequently. "Bring Sarah for dinner," he'd say. Or, "I'm hosting a small get-together, and Sarah should come along." At first, I didn't think much of it. I figured he was trying to make an effort, and Sarah, ever gracious, thought it was sweet. One Saturday, he invited us over for lunch. It was cold, with light snow dusting the streets as we drove to his house. Sarah wore a long coat and a knit hat, and I remember her joking, "Maybe your dad's just lonely, Ethan. He probably likes having company." Lonely wasn't a word I'd ever used to describe my dad. He wasn't the kind of person who seemed to need anyone. But I shrugged it off. Lunch was fine, normal, even. We ate in the dining room, and my dad was unusually chatty, asking Sarah about her thoughts on politics, business trends, and even literature. At one point, he leaned forward and said, "You have a sharp mind, Sarah. You're going to go far." "Thank you, Mr. Carter," she replied, her cheeks flushing slightly. "That means a lot coming from you." After lunch, I stepped out for about 30 minutes to pick up a part for my car. When I came back, Sarah and my dad were in the study, laughing over some old photo album he'd pulled out. "You never told me you played baseball in high school," Sarah said, glancing up at me. "That's because it's not exactly a highlight of my life," I replied, forcing a chuckle. My dad chimed in, "Ethan was a natural. If he'd stuck with it, who knows where he'd be now." The comment wasn't meant to be cruel, but it rubbed me the wrong way. My dad had always had a way of framing my choices as disappointments, and hearing him say it in front of Sarah stung. By January, my dad's interactions with Sarah became more deliberate. During one visit, he asked Sarah to stay behind after lunch for tea while I went to run errands. "I'd like to chat with her about some career advice," he said, almost dismissively. When I came back, Sarah seemed fine, happy, even. "Your dad has some great stories about starting his business," she said in the car. "He's so driven." "I can see where you get it from." I laughed bitterly. Driven, huh? That's one word for it. Another time, he invited us over for what he called a casual dinner. About halfway through, he suggested Sarah help him pick out a wine from his cellar. "I'd love to get your opinion," he said to her. It wasn't until I was left alone at the table that I realized I'd been excluded from that particular activity. They came back about 15 minutes later, chatting and laughing like old friends. "What's funny?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. "Oh, your dad was just telling me about a disastrous dinner party he hosted years ago," Sarah said. "Apparently, someone spilled wine all over a priceless rug." I nodded, though inside, I felt uneasy. My dad never shared personal stories like that, not with me, at least. The incident that truly made me stop brushing off my suspicions happened in mid-February. It was a gloomy day, and I had to attend a work meeting downtown. My dad offered to let Sarah hang out at his house while I was busy. When I came back to pick her up, I found them in his study again. Sarah was sitting in his chair, flipping through a book, while he stood nearby, leaning on the desk. They were both laughing about something I couldn't hear. "Hey," I said, walking in. "What's going on?" "Oh, nothing," Sarah said, standing up quickly. "Your dad was just showing me his collection of first edition books. Did you know he has a signed copy of To Kill a Mockingbird?" "No," I said flatly, looking at my dad. "I didn't." On the drive home, I finally asked Sarah directly, "Does my dad ever, I don't know, make you uncomfortable?" She frowned, clearly surprised. "Uncomfortable? No, not at all." "Why would you think that?" "I don't know," I admitted, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. "It's just, he's never been this interested in anyone I've brought around before." "Maybe he's just trying to connect," she suggested, her tone gentle. "Ethan, you've told me how distant he's been with you. Maybe this is his way of making up for it." "Maybe," I muttered, though I wasn't convinced. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time we visited, I felt like a third wheel in my own relationship. My dad's attentiveness to Sarah didn't seem inappropriate, exactly, it was more subtle than that. But it was enough to put me on edge. Sarah, for her part, didn't seem to notice anything unusual. She genuinely seemed to like my dad, often commenting on how brilliant and fascinating he was. "You're lucky to have a dad like him," she said once, and I almost laughed out loud. If only she knew the truth. It was around March when I started noticing a shift in Sarah's behavior. It wasn't like she'd suddenly turned into a different person, no, it was more subtle than that. After those last few visits with my dad, she just seemed preoccupied. At first, I chalked it up to her being busy with her studies and work. After all, grad school was no small feat, but as the weeks went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I'd ask her if she wanted to go out for a quick dinner or take a walk in the park on those rare sunny March days, and she'd give me excuses that felt flimsy. "I'm swamped with work," or "I promised a friend I'd help her with a project." Sometimes she'd tell me to go hang out with my buddies and not worry about waiting up. There were days she'd barely text me, claiming she'd been too busy to check her phone. Sarah used to always make time for us, no matter how packed her schedule was. But now, even when we were together, it was like she wasn't really there. I'd be talking to her, and she'd nod and smile, but I could tell her mind was somewhere else. The strangest part was how often she brought up my dad. I'll never forget one evening when I was driving her home. Out of nowhere, she turned to me and said, "You know, Ethan, I think your dad is lonelier than he lets on. He seems, I don't know, a bit worn out." I shrugged, not sure where she was going with this. "I mean, he's a workaholic, Sarah. He's been like that since I was a kid." She nodded thoughtfully, as if she had some kind of insight into him that I didn't. "I just think he could really use some company. Have you ever thought about spending more time with him? Maybe staying over there now and then?" I laughed, brushing it off. "Yeah, I'm sure he'd love that," I said sarcastically. "Dad's never wanted company, least of all mine." But she didn't drop it. "Maybe it's different now. People change," you know? Especially after going through losses. Her suggestion left me feeling uneasy, but I didn't press her on it right away. Part of me figured maybe she was just trying to get me to reconnect with him, maybe she was playing the role of good girlfriend, encouraging me to patch things up with family. But at the same time, it felt strange. As the weeks went by, I started noticing more changes in her. For one, she'd gotten into the habit of staying late at work. Sarah was never one to clock extra hours unless she really had to, but now, every other night, she'd send a quick text saying she was caught up with a deadline or that there was some last-minute thing she needed to finish. One Friday evening, I'd planned a simple dinner at our favorite Mexican spot, thinking it might be a good way to catch up. I called her up that afternoon, but she sounded distracted. "Ethan, I might have to take a rain check," she said, her voice muffled like she was multitasking. "It's been a crazy day." "On a Friday?" I joked, trying to keep the mood light. "Come on, we both know nobody does real work after 3 p.m. on Fridays." She let out a quick laugh, but it was empty. "Well, in my world, we do. Look, why don't you go grab dinner with your friends? I'll see you tomorrow." When I hung up, I felt that familiar pang of doubt. She'd never turned down plans with me before. And it wasn't just dinner, she'd been making excuses about spending time together for a while now. The other thing that kept nagging at me was how frequently she brought up my dad. At first, she'd only make passing comments, like, "Your dad's really interesting," or "I think he's a bit misunderstood." But as time went on, her suggestions became more direct. One evening, as we sat on her couch watching TV, she looked over at me and said, "It wouldn't hurt to check in on him more often. He seems like he needs it." I shrugged, trying to sound casual. "I don't know, Sarah. He's not exactly the touchy-feely type." She nodded but didn't drop it. "Still, I think it'd mean a lot to him. Maybe even to you, too." Then came the comment that really stuck with me. One night, she turned to me out of the blue and said, "Ethan, I think your dad's lonely. I can't imagine how hard it must be to lose a partner and then not have anyone close." I raised an eyebrow. "My dad? Sarah, he's barely acknowledged anyone since my mom died. He's fine." She gave me a sympathetic smile. "Maybe that's why he needs you around more." Her words made sense on the surface, but something felt forced, like she was trying too hard to get me to spend time with him. Finally, there was the day she suggested I grab coffee with him. "Why don't you ask your dad to meet up for coffee or lunch sometime? It might be nice to have a father-son chat, I stared at her, taken aback. "Sarah, this is my dad we're talking about. We don't just grab coffee and catch up." She sighed, giving me a patient smile. "People can surprise you, Ethan. It might be worth a shot. Worst case, you're out for coffee." That comment bothered me. Why was she pushing so hard? And why now? My dad and I had been distant for years, and Sarah knew that. It wasn't like we'd ever had heart-to-heart talks over coffee. By April, I was starting to feel genuinely uneasy. Sarah's late nights, her growing distance, her constant mentions of my dad, it all seemed to add up to something, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Whenever I tried to bring it up, she'd brush it off or give me an understanding smile, as if I were being paranoid. But it was hard to ignore the changes in her. I kept asking myself if I was reading too much into things. Maybe she was just stressed, or maybe she was actually trying to help me reconnect with my dad. But in my gut, I felt something wasn't right. I'd catch myself staring at her, wondering what was going on in her head. And as much as I tried to shake it, the feeling only grew. The harder I tried to ignore it, the more those tiny, unsettling moments piled up. I'd been in the military. I knew how to trust my instincts. And right then, they were telling me that something was definitely wrong. By late April, the situation had reached a new level of strange. Sarah started pushing this idea that I should consider moving back to my dad's place. She framed it as a way to be there for him since, according to her, he needed more support than ever. I'll be honest, this suggestion didn't sit right with me. But Sarah was persistent, as though she was on some kind of mission to convince me. The topic first came up during a rainy Thursday evening. We were having takeout in our apartment, and out of nowhere, she brought up my dad's health. "I've noticed your dad looking a little worn out lately, Ethan," she said, putting her fork down and glancing at me. "He mentioned he's dealing with some heart issues. Have you noticed it?" I paused, surprised. I didn't know my dad had even mentioned his health to her. "No, he's never said anything to me about it," I replied, feeling a twinge of guilt for not being more involved. She sighed. "Maybe he's just trying to keep it to himself. He seems like the type who wouldn't want anyone fussing over him. But Ethan, maybe this is a chance to be there for him in a way you haven't been able to before." The way she phrased it sounded so scripted. But I didn't want to argue with her, so I just nodded, feeling uneasy. Over the next week, Sarah kept bringing it up. "Think about it," she'd say. "He could really use the support, and you'd still have all your own space. You know that house is huge, plenty of privacy for both of you." She even went as far as offering to help me pack up my things. "I can help organize and sort everything," she suggested one Saturday, her enthusiasm almost unnerving. "It'll be like a fresh start." "What about us?" I asked one evening, halfway laughing. "You're really okay with me moving out and staying with my dad?" She gave me a small smile, squeezing my hand. "Ethan, this doesn't change us. Besides, we're still young. We can make it work. I just think this is something you need to do for him, and maybe even for yourself." It was unsettling how easily she brushed off the idea of us being apart. This was a girl who used to get upset if I missed date night, and now she was all but packing my bags for me to leave. Something just felt wrong. Around that time, Sarah also started making plans for me to meet with my dad more often. "Why don't you invite him for lunch this Sunday?" she'd suggest. "Or you could go golfing together, didn't you say you used to play a lot?" One weekend, she even arranged a dinner for us at a nearby steakhouse, a place Dad loved. It was odd, honestly. Sarah had always been friendly with my family, but now she was coordinating meetups as though she were my dad's assistant. "What's with all the organizing?" I finally asked her after she set up yet another dinner. She gave me a soft smile, almost like I'd missed the obvious. "I just think he could use a friend right now, Ethan. And who better than his son?" But something felt staged about the whole setup. When I'd show up to these lunches or dinners, my dad was polite but somewhat distant, as if he didn't understand why we were suddenly spending so much time together either. He'd even asked me once, "Is Sarah pushing this?" I didn't know what to say. The truth was, I didn't fully understand her motives myself. The final straw came one evening after Sarah came back from a visit with my dad. She dropped by to bring him a book he'd supposedly mentioned wanting to read, something she had never done before. When she got home, she had this look in her eyes, a strange mix of excitement and determination. "Ethan," she said, sitting me down on the couch, "I really think you should consider moving back in with him. He talked about how he misses having someone around, someone he can rely on." I raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "Since when did he start opening up to you like that?" "Oh, you know, people open up when you really listen." She shrugged, trying to sound casual, but her eagerness was undeniable. She offered to help me find a moving company, even suggested she could help set up a nice little area in his house where I could have some privacy and still be around to check in on him. It was like she'd thought of every single detail, as if she were laying out a full-fledged plan. "Sarah, why are you so invested in this?" I finally asked, not bothering to hide the edge in my voice. "It's like you're pushing me to do this." She looked taken aback, but only for a second. "Ethan, I'm just looking out for you and your dad. I think this could be a positive change, for both of you." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't adding up. I started wondering if she had some kind of ulterior motive. Why was she so determined to have me move in with my dad? And why did she seem so at ease with me potentially moving out of our place? One night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything that had happened since she'd first met my dad. It hit me like a ton of bricks, the sudden interest in my dad's life, her constant pushes to spend more time with him, and now this near-obsessive insistence that I move in with him. I couldn't help but feel like I was being manipulated. Whether it was my dad or Sarah, or both, I didn't know. But I did know one thing, something was definitely going on. And whatever it was, it seemed like they wanted me out of the picture. It was a Friday night, and I'd finally convinced Sarah to set aside some time for us. We hadn't been out together in what felt like forever. So, I made a reservation at this Italian restaurant we both loved, small, family-owned, and nestled in a quiet part of town. It was one of those places that felt like a real escape, where we could just focus on each other without any distractions. I called her earlier that day to check in, reminding her of our plans. "Hey, just a heads up, we're all set for 7:30, I said, trying to sound upbeat. I was honestly excited to finally get some one-on-one time. But then came the excuse. "Ethan, I'm really sorry," she said, her voice sounding tired. "There's just so much at the office. I don't think I'll make it tonight." I felt that familiar disappointment, but I tried not to let it show. "Can't you just leave early? I mean, we haven't gone out in a while." She hesitated. I know, but tonight's just one of those nights. Rain check, okay?" I forced myself to be understanding. "Sure," I said, though I couldn't hide the deflation in my voice. "We'll just figure something out later." As I hung up, a part of me started wondering why it seemed like later was always her answer these days. But I pushed it aside, telling myself she was genuinely busy. With my night now wide open, I found myself at a bit of a loss. I didn't feel like going home to an empty place. So, on a whim, I decided to go visit my dad at the hospital. He'd been admitted a few days earlier for a minor heart procedure, something about needing an updated diagnosis on his condition. I hadn't planned on visiting that night, but since Sarah wasn't around, I thought it might be good to check in on him. I drove to the hospital, parked in a nearly empty garage, and walked across the cold pavement. The halls were quiet, except for the faint sounds of machines and hushed conversations between nurses. My dad's room was on the third floor, down a long corridor that felt strangely eerie in the late-night dimness. When I reached his room, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. I slowed down, planning to knock gently before entering. But as I approached, I stopped dead in my tracks. Through the small gap in the door, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Sarah was there, sitting by my dad's bedside, holding his hand. And it wasn't the kind of casual hand-holding that friends or family do. No, this was something entirely different. She was leaning close, her face soft and affectionate in a way I'd never seen. I saw my dad reach up, gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. The look in his eyes was intimate. He was smiling at her, a warmth and tenderness I'd never seen him show anyone, let alone me. I froze, unable to process what I was seeing. I watched as she leaned in closer, whispering something I couldn't hear, her fingers tracing small circles on his hand. He laughed softly, then reached out, cupping her face in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. They were locked in their own world, oblivious to anyone else. My heart felt like it had been ripped from my chest. I couldn't make sense of it, couldn't wrap my head around the betrayal unfolding right before my eyes. A sickening mix of anger, confusion, and heartbreak surged through me, and I felt my body go cold. I backed away from the door, my mind reeling. I didn't know what to do, where to go, or who to talk to. The woman I loved, the woman I thought was building a future with me, was here, sharing intimate moments with my own father. It was as if every suspicion, every uneasy feeling I'd brushed off, had been leading to this exact moment. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, staring into a void I couldn't comprehend. I stumbled down the hall, away from the room, each step heavier than the last. My hands were shaking as I pressed the elevator button, feeling an overwhelming urge to get out of that building, to breathe fresh air, to escape the twisted reality I'd just witnessed. As I drove home in silence, I tried to piece everything together, but nothing made sense. Questions raced through my mind. Had this been going on all along? Was Sarah ever really in love with me? And my dad, why him? What was his role in all of this? I spent that night in a daze, replaying what I'd seen over and over. The betrayal cut so deep that I didn't know how to begin processing it. It felt like my world had crumbled in an instant. The woman I trusted with everything, and the father I'd spent my life resenting, were somehow united in their betrayal. Lying awake in the dark, I realized I had been blind, ignoring every red flag, every warning sign. And now, as the full weight of their betrayal settled in, I knew there was no going back. Whatever happened next, my relationship with both of them was irreversibly shattered. In the days after that night at the hospital, I didn't let on that anything was wrong. I kept my composure, stayed calm, and continued to play the part of the loving boyfriend Sarah thought she knew. But beneath the surface, I was coldly calculating, piecing together a plan that would leave both her and my father exposed, with no room for denial or excuses. I knew I couldn't go for a simple confrontation. They'd just deny everything, twist it around, and I'd be left with nothing but my own shattered pride. Instead, I needed undeniable proof. More than that, I wanted them to be caught in a way that would strip away their carefully crafted facades. First, I started gathering evidence. I made sure to keep things subtle, no sudden changes, no overly suspicious behavior. I had a buddy from my military days, Mike, who ran a small tech security company now. Mike wasn't the type to ask a lot of questions, which was exactly what I needed. I told him I was having concerns about Sarah's loyalty, and without hesitation, he offered to help me out. Within days, I had access to Sarah's messages. I didn't just want screenshots of flirty texts. No, I needed something more. Mike helped me monitor her messages, including some deleted ones, and set up ways to track her phone calls. Slowly, I began to see a pattern emerge: calls made to my dad, brief and often in the late evening hours. Messages that looked innocent at first glance, but read between the lines, they were more than friendly exchanges. It was exactly what I needed. Collecting evidence was one thing, but I wanted something bigger, something that would make them regret ever thinking they could betray me like this. My dad was due to host a charity gala in a few weeks, a big event that would gather everyone from his business associates to family friends. This wasn't just any event, it was his chance to show off his success and connections, a night where he shined in the eyes of the community. I knew he'd want Sarah there, too. She'd become something of a favorite in his social circle, and he often invited her to events under the guise of keeping her close to the family. The gala was perfect, an event where everyone they wanted to impress would be present, and where a slip-up or revelation would have maximum impact. I began laying the groundwork, keeping my voice calm and supportive around Sarah, nodding along when she mentioned my dad's health or their friendly talks. I even played the concerned boyfriend, saying things like, "I'm glad you're looking out for him." I'd probably go nuts if I had to manage his business and health issues. She seemed almost relieved that I was so understanding, unaware that every nod and smile was part of my plan. It was mid-May, and the annual charity gala hosted by my dad's company was just around the corner. This was the event of the year for him, a night where he could show off his success, mingle with high-powered executives, and cement his image as a man of influence and integrity. The irony wasn't lost on me. This year, though, things were going to be different. The event was set to take place at the Grand Ballroom of the Hilton downtown, a swanky venue with sparkling chandeliers and polished marble floors. The guest list was full of CEOs, politicians, and community leaders, the kind of people my dad thrived on impressing. And as expected, he wanted Sarah to attend as my date. "It'll be good to have her there," he said during a brief phone call earlier in the week. "She's got a certain charm that people respond to." I forced a smile through the phone. "Yeah, Dad. She's great, isn't she?" Sarah, for her part, seemed excited about the event. She spent days picking out the perfect dress, a sleek navy number that hugged her figure in all the right places. I pretended to match her enthusiasm, offering compliments and pretending like I was looking forward to it too. Inside, though, I was calculating every step of my plan. The night before the gala, I sent 2 anonymous messages, one to Sarah and one to my dad. The messages were simple but effective. Room 237 at the Hilton will be set aside for a private meeting during the gala. Use the key card at the concierge desk. No one will know. It was the kind of bait they couldn't resist. I knew they'd want to sneak away during the event, thinking they could have their moment in private. Little did they know, I'd already rigged the room with hidden cameras and microphones, thanks to my friend Mike. He had ensured everything was set to capture both video and audio, and more importantly, it was connected to the AV system in the ballroom. On the night of the event, I arrived with Sarah on my arm, looking every bit the supportive boyfriend. She smiled and laughed, charming everyone we spoke to, while I played along like nothing was wrong. My dad greeted us near the entrance, all smiles and handshakes. "Ethan, Sarah, glad you made it," he said, his tone warm and polished. "Wouldn't miss it," I replied, flashing a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. The night went on as expected. Speeches were made, drinks were poured, and the room buzzed with laughter and conversation. At one point, I caught Sarah slipping away toward the elevators, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. My dad followed not long after, casually excusing himself from a group of executives. I stayed back, mingling just enough to avoid suspicion. Inside, my heart was racing, not with anxiety, but with the thrill of what was about to happen. About 45 minutes later, it was my turn to take the stage for a brief speech. My dad had asked me to say a few words about the company's charitable efforts, and I gladly agreed, knowing it was the perfect opportunity. As I spoke, Mike was in the control booth, ready to cue up the footage. I kept my speech short and sweet, then transitioned smoothly into what I called a special presentation. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice steady, "tonight, we've prepared a little something to celebrate the spirit of connection and partnership that drives us all. We're calling it the Circle of Love. It's a tribute to the relationships that make events like this possible." The lights dimmed, and the screen behind me came to life. At first, it showed a generic slideshow of smiling couples and stock footage of teamwork. But then, the feed switched to the live video from room 237. The room fell silent as the screen revealed Sarah and my dad, sitting close on the couch. His hand was on her knee, and hers rested on his shoulder. The audio kicked in next, their voices clear and unmistakable. "Richard," Sarah's voice purred, "you're always so good to me." "And you," my dad replied, leaning in closer, "are the best thing to happen in a long time." Then came the kiss. The gasp that rippled through the room was almost deafening. People turned to each other, their faces a mix of shock, disbelief, and disgust. Someone near the front audibly muttered, "Oh my God." I stepped back from the podium, letting the footage play for another few seconds before signaling Mike to cut the feed. The lights came back up, and I faced the crowd, a calm smile on my face. "Well," I said, breaking the stunned silence, "that certainly wasn't the partnership we were expecting to highlight tonight." You'd think being caught like that would make most people slink away, ashamed or at least regretful. But my dad and Sarah? They didn't have a shred of that. If anything, their reaction left me feeling like I'd been hit twice as hard. After the gala disaster, they did what I would have never expected, they doubled down, deciding to go public with their relationship. It was like my trap had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience to them. Not even a week after the gala, I started hearing whispers about them. One afternoon, while getting coffee at a nearby cafe, I ran into one of my dad's old colleagues. He pulled me aside, giving me a long, pitying look before dropping the news. "You know, your dad's talking about marrying her, right?" he said, like he was sharing some big, unspeakable scandal. I stared at him, unsure if I'd heard correctly. "Excuse me?" "Oh, yeah. He's planning to announce it publicly soon. Said he's done hiding." The idea hit me like a brick to the chest. Marriage? My dad, marrying Sarah? I walked out of that cafe in a daze. How did it come to this? I'd spent days picturing them dealing with the fallout, embarrassed and humiliated. Instead, they were throwing everything back in my face. Sarah had betrayed me in the worst possible way, and now they were going to flaunt it like some twisted badge of honor. A couple of days later, I finally decided to confront him. I drove over to his house, a place I'd once avoided because of our strained relationship, but now I couldn't even look at it without feeling a sick sense of anger. I parked outside, taking a few deep breaths before walking up to the door. When he opened the door, he barely looked surprised to see me. "Ethan," he said coolly, stepping aside to let me in. We walked into his study, the room I'd once associated with his work, his accomplishments, but now it just felt like a hollow shrine to a man I hardly recognized. I could see Sarah's stains here and there, a scarf on the back of a chair, a coffee mug that wasn't as usual. It was unsettling, like she was slowly infiltrating every corner of his life. "So," I started, trying to keep my voice steady, "you're really going through with this? With Sarah?" He sighed, sitting back in his chair as if we were about to have a casual conversation. "Yes, Ethan. We're not hiding anymore. It's what we both want." The way he said it made my blood boil. "What do you both want?" "Dad, you're willing to throw away your relationship with me for her? Don't you care about the damage this is causing?" He looked at me, his gaze calm and almost patronizing. "You're a grown man, Ethan. I'd expect you to understand that sometimes things don't work out the way you want. Sarah and I, we have a connection. I'm not going to apologize for pursuing my happiness. His happiness. As if my pain didn't even register. You realize everyone is disgusted by this, right?" I shot back, my voice rising. "People are talking, Dad. Your colleagues, your friends, they're all looking at you like a joke. And Sarah's just standing by, letting you go through with this." He shrugged, completely unfazed. "People will talk, Ethan. Let them. It's my life, not theirs." I looked at him, stunned by how far he was willing to go. There was no remorse, no shame. He was a man who'd lived his entire life by his own rules, and apparently, that wasn't going to change now. True to his word, my dad made an official announcement a week later. He and Sarah were together, and yes, they had plans to get married. He didn't bother with a big press release, but word got out quickly enough. I saw the looks from family friends, from neighbors, and even from some of my coworkers who'd heard the news. My aunt, my dad's sister, called me a few days later, her voice shaking with disbelief. "I just can't believe he'd do this to you, Ethan." And with Sarah, of all people. She'd been one of the few family members I'd stay close to, and hearing the hurt in her voice only made the pain feel sharper. I went to her house that weekend for dinner. She tried to comfort me, making my favorite meal and giving me a hug as soon as I walked in the door. She even pulled out some old family albums, reminiscing about the days when things had been simpler. "Your mother would have been heartbroken, Ethan," she said, flipping through a worn photo album. She showed me pictures of our family vacations, back when my mom was still alive, back when we'd actually felt like a family. This isn't the man she married. The sad part was, I wasn't sure if my dad had ever been the man I'd wanted him to be. The betrayal with Sarah just drove that fact home. The first time I saw them together in public after the announcement was at a company function. Against all logic, my dad decided to bring her along as his date. Seeing them together, holding hands, laughing as if nothing in the world was wrong, it was like a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. People whispered, their eyes darting between me and them. Some shook their heads in disgust, others just looked away, uncomfortable with the whole scene. It was a public spectacle, the very thing I'd thought would bring them shame, but they were thriving on it. Sarah stayed glued to his side, her smile bright and unwavering, as if she didn't care about the stares, the whispers, or the complete humiliation she'd thrown my way. For them, it was just another step forward in a life they'd decided to build together, without a second thought to the damage they'd caused. In the end, my dad and Sarah went through with their wedding, a small, quiet affair that took place on an overcast Saturday morning. They tried to keep it simple, something tasteful, as they put it. But it was hard to ignore the reality, no one was there to celebrate with them. Not one family member, no old friends, no colleagues who had once respected my dad and even liked Sarah. They'd all kept their distance, too uncomfortable with the betrayal, too appalled to offer their congratulations. The ceremony was held at a modest little chapel just outside town, and from what I heard, the guest list consisted of only a few people, mostly strangers who didn't know the story behind the couple standing at the altar. My aunt, who had been so close to me and had watched me grow up, later told me that my dad had invited her, even knowing how furious she was. She turned him down flat, reminding him that his actions had cost him nearly every relationship he'd built over the years. The fact that Sarah went through with it was no surprise, but it was still jarring to think about. She'd come into my life, wrapped herself around me, only to tear away everything that mattered, leaving me in the ruins of a life I once thought I understood. It was clear that my dad and Sarah didn't care about the fallout, about the friends they'd lost or the family that had shunned them. From what I'd heard, they'd even made a show of it, posing for photos with bright, defiant smiles, as if daring the world to question their choice. For weeks after the wedding, it felt like everyone in town was buzzing about them. People whispered about the scandal, shaking their heads at the betrayal and at how brazen they were about it all. Family friends who had once gathered for holiday dinners or company events now made it clear they wanted nothing to do with them. The isolation was palpable, and yet, my dad and Sarah seemed almost proud of their rebellious choice, as if they'd done something bold and noble instead of selfish and hurtful. "Ethan, they've dug themselves into a hole," my aunt had said over the phone one evening. "They're the ones left with the mess. They're the ones who have to live with the consequences." I held on to those words, reminding myself that their choice to cut me out, to turn our family's legacy into a sideshow, was a burden they'd chosen for themselves. I hadn't made that choice, and I refused to let it dictate my future. From that point on, I felt like a stranger looking in on my own life. Here were people who, for so long, I thought were my own, the father I'd tried to understand, the woman I'd once imagined a future with. And now, they were wrapped up in this strange, toxic world they'd created together, pushing me farther and farther out until I was no longer part of the life I'd known. It was an isolating feeling, but at the same time, it brought me clarity. Their love was built on broken trust and betrayal, and even though it looked strong from the outside, I knew it would be a matter of time before it crumbled. It wasn't a life I envied, and it wasn't something I wanted to be part of. In a way, I found a kind of peace in letting go. I realized that moving forward, I had the freedom to make my life my own, without the shadows of my father's choices or Sarah's betrayal hanging over me. But even as I distanced myself, a part of me couldn't ignore the pull I felt toward my family's legacy, the company my mother had helped build before her memory had been tarnished by the people who claimed to love her. After everything that happened, it was clear there was nothing left for me in that life, nothing except pain and betrayal. I'd been blindsided, humiliated, and forced to confront just how deeply they'd cut me out of their plans. They'd built their own little world, and I was just an afterthought. So, one cold morning in late fall, I packed up what little I hadn't already discarded, tossed my bags in the car, and drove away without looking back. It wasn't just a decision to leave, it was the only decision that made sense. Staying meant living in the shadow of their lies, surrounded by the constant reminder of what I'd lost. No amount of apologies could repair what they'd broken. Leaving was the only way I could start fresh, somewhere far away from the tangled mess they'd made of my life. But as I drove, mile after mile, I realized there was one thing I couldn't quite shake: the company. For years, I'd watched my dad expand it, but at the expense of everything else. The truth is, that company had never just been his. My mom had been there in the beginning, working late hours to help him build it before her own dreams fell to the wayside, and she poured everything into making our home instead. Her spirit was in that company as much as his ambition was, even if no one else saw it that way. I'd been angry, blindsided, and heartbroken, but driving away that day, I also felt something new, a sense of resolve. My dad had betrayed me in every way possible, choosing to protect Sarah and his own image over the family he'd once had. And while I knew leaving was the only way to survive, I couldn't let go of the idea that someday, I'd come back. I'd come back and take back what was rightfully mine. The company wasn't just a business, it was my mother's legacy, something she'd helped build before she was pushed aside, much like I was. It deserved better than the man who'd hijacked it for his own selfish ends. So, while I left town to rebuild my life, I couldn't help but keep that thought alive in the back of my mind. One day, when the time was right, I'd come back. I'd reclaim the legacy that belonged to my family, not just to the people who had used it to suit their own selfish needs. They thought they'd written me out of the story, but I knew that one day, I'd make my way back. And when I did, it would be on my own terms, a return that would restore everything they thought they'd buried for good.